Hi everyone, this is Grandmaster Josh Friedel, and today I'd like to cover the topic of the isolated pawn. A few notes before I begin. I changed my layout, as you'd notice if you follow my channel. If you like my content, by the way, definitely subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any videos, and like videos if you like them, that kind of thing. It always is supportive. Um, Definitely want to thank everyone for their support so far. It's been pretty cool. And I haven't gotten to post a video in a while, so I wanted to catch up a bit. I want to get back to doing it regularly. But yeah, I changed my layout a bit. So any feedback, whether it's good or bad, is very useful. I'm still trying to find what works, but I was told by at least one person, actually two people, that it was a bit too dark. And I don't want it to seem like a depressing, brooding channel. So I'm trying to change the color scheme. I don't know if it works. I'm very bad with color schemes in general. I don't want to say I'm colorblind, but I'm color challenged. That's good enough. Anyways, I know it's not the important stuff. I want to create, give good lessons and stuff like that. But if the colors do not work, I would like to know, and I will try to change them for you to make it reasonable. But because I have a lot of background, I didn't want it to be too dark. So, any case, here we go. We're going to try. Hopefully you can look at it. So this position occurred in the game between Michael Tal and Paul Caris. Caris was black. Caris, incidentally, one of my favorite players of all time. If I actually had to name like a player, like an all-time great player who I would try to emulate, who I've tried to emulate, it would actually be Paul Caris, even over world champions. For whatever reason, his style really just appealed to me. He was kind of an aggressive player, but pretty well rounded. Like it was very important for him to get good at kind of all the phases of the game. Obviously, most elite players aren't bad at too many things, but he was a really well-rounded player. Played closed positions, played open positions, varied his openings, but definitely had a sort of aggressive streak, as well as he liked classic kind of positions. So I got a lot from him, and one of the things I definitely noticed he did well was play with an isolated pawn. So I think there's kind of a sort of taboo on isolated pawns. I've noticed that even my generation of players, and after that, like people hate playing with an isolated pawn. And there are so many sources of how do you play against an isolated pawn. You blockade it with a piece, you attack it, you destroy it. There are so many manuals on how to play against it. And don't get me wrong, that's really important. There are lots of positions having an isolated pawn is ugly. It is not very pleasant. But there's not as much in how to play with it. So I wanted to do a video of playing with isolated pawn, so I wanted to show this kind of classic example. And then I actually want to delve into a couple candidates games, which just finished. I'm probably going to do a lot of candidate games in my stuff, just because there are so many interesting battles, where an isolated pawn was featured. And I think that a lot of people who are watching, especially not so much the players, definitely didn't have a great idea of things from what I was seeing. So I really wanted to do that. So we have this position. We obviously have an isolated pawn. We have two knights against bishop and knight. Looks like a normal enough game. Caris was black. So the question is, how do you approach such a position? So what would you think here? What would you play? If you want to pause and try to figure stuff out, this is a good moment. So one of the most important concepts with an isolated pawn, and this is very important to know it whether you're playing against it or with it, is the most important square, generally speaking, is the square in front of the pawn. This square here, ooh, it's a pretty color on this. I've never had this color scheme in chess base, so we're all going to be discovering things together. It's going to be excellent. Oop. This color square, so this d4 square, is really, really important. And the reason why it's so important is because if the pawn is blockaded and cannot move, it's not the end of the world, but it does mean that it's more likely to become weak later. So that's one thing. The square in front of the pawn is extremely important. The other thing is that piece trades in general, you have to be very careful of. Now, it depends on what piece trade it is, of course. But for example, if we end up in a position where the minors get traded, bishop and knight get traded for these two knights, and we're left with this very sad pawn, not to mention our b pawns are not exactly wonderful, that's where you're going to suffer. So it's very important when you're playing with isolated pawn to realize you need play of some kind. I don't always view it as like a defect in a position to have an isolated pawn. I really don't think it is, but it can become one. And you have to be very, very careful to make sure you're active. If you have an isolated pawn and you're playing passive moves, you're probably going to end up in a bad position. An isolated pawn forces you to play actively. So you want to play actively. You often do have extra space with an isolated pawn. If you're able to push the pawn, you get even more space. And so, like, using your extra space, keeping pieces on the board, trying to grip, like the pawn grips the d4 and the e4 and c4 squares very well. These are important central squares. So it does a lot for our position. Just keep in mind, in the long term, if we don't do enough and we allow white to simplify the game, that's where we're going to have problems here. So Caris played a really excellent move that shows very good understanding of the position. He plays rook e4, targeting the d4 square. So his eye is on this d4 square. So one very important detail is if white tries to simplify the game, we play b takes c6, and now our pawns are actually very nice. As you can see, we no longer have a weakness. We have easy play. We're going to double rooks. We have great activity. I don't think we have any problems. Probably white should have gone knight c2 instead of knight f3. The main reason is that now f3 is at least a resource. So if we play a move like d4, for example, they have f3. Don't get me wrong, I still think our position is pretty reasonable. We're going to probably bring our rook over to e8. The e2 pawn's a bit of a target, as well as d4. But this would have at least given white some degree of counterplay, I believe. So instead, the move knight f3 was played. So here, Caris played rook a e8. I think it would have been better to play d4 even right away. So the whole point is that this pawn is actually very annoying. We're going to play queen d5, which means that the knight won't be able to move. We're going to have issues with the king. And from there, we can do many things. We can double rooks, right? Play rook a e8. We can maneuver a knight to c5, for example. We have so many things that we can do there. And for white's perspective, it's just going to be really annoying to even find like reasonable moves, right? Like you can put a rook on d1, just for instance, right? But I park my queen on d5. Let's say you want to get out of this, you play a move like this, I double rooks. Already we can see that this is getting really unpleasant. This d4 pawn is not a weakness even remotely. And we have just enormous pressure. The e2 pawn is definitely a bit weak. Our pieces don't do much, or white's pieces, sorry. So this is kind of where your isolated pawn, your isolated queen pawn in this case, is just really strong. It's not a weakness even slightly. So sort of a great example of how the pawn can actually be quite good. Now, it is something where you have to be careful, right? One slip and the pawn becomes not so good. So it's one of those things where you need to be careful, you need to be precise, but if you play actively and you really work on advancing the pawn, controlling the square in front of the pawn, that's often a very good approach. There are exceptions to this. There are times you should absolutely not push your isolated pawn. You have to make sure it's well defended, but just in general, if you can advance it, you're also taking a bit of extra space. You have extra squares to operate. Your opponent has fewer squares to operate. It tends to be quite good. So Caris played this, which is slightly inaccurate, and now d4 after bishop retreats. Because the bishop on f4 is actually not doing a whole lot, believe it or not. So here, like, I think the one chance white had was something like this, with the idea that on queen d5 they can play here, trying to at least exchange queens and take some pressure off. This is a bit of an odd way to play. It's not so easy to find. Tal, as white did not find it. Tal instead played e3. So it's quite funny. You can see that Tal's approach here is that he actually wants to trade off this d4 pawn. He's like, I've had enough of this thing in my face. I can't move with that thing there. So you can really see how the isolated pawn in this kind of position was not a weakness. And the way Caris played was really instructive. He played queen d5, taking advantage of these pins. Rook takes d4. So he grabs on e8 and plays queen e2, so he's hitting this knight. But Caris moves in. Notice how this pin makes it so that this rook cannot be captured. So he probably should try bishop b4, just trying to exchange off these knights. These knights are super strong, and trying to trade them off, even if you're able to grab this bishop, you're at least having to give up a knight. You have these bad pawns. This would have at least been a reasonable try. As it was, this happened, and I'm not going to show the whole game, even though the game was actually really instructive. There was an instructive technical phase of this game as well. But he simply brought his knight in, he brought his rook in, and it's very obvious that something has gone horribly wrong for white. So here he took on e3, which is good, but even moves like b5, just cementing this knight, look just ugh. So you can see how like black just dominates the board now, and he ended up, what he did in the game was he did this and simply went for a double attack. So he played in a concrete way, which I think is perfectly good. And he ended up winning a really, really nice game. It's from the Candidates Tournament in 1959. Caris was a top player for a very, very long time, actually. So, he had played a lot of candidates. He was close in lots of them. I think he finished second 4 times in a row, something really crazy. But in any case, this was a really instructive game. It's definitely one you can check out. I don't want to rush through it because I want to stick to this topic. But definitely a very cool game. So the next one I want to show you are 2 modern games, again, from this current candidate tournament. So chess has changed quite a bit since that time. But one thing that you'll notice is that I didn't change my background on this. Oh, give me a sec, guys. One sec. Sorry, I swear I'm a professional. Usually, most of the time. This is just a blip. I didn't know you had to change them all separately. ChessBase is really letting me down. Anyways, in any case, so this was a position that occurred in Nepomniachtchi against Nakamura from the Candidates Tournament. And it was another example, really, for me, where the isolated pawn was clearly not a weakness, even remotely. So in this position, Nakamura did some kind of odd opening prep, which it didn't work all that well, in my opinion. Like, white's position looks very good. So black could have played... The problem here is that he takes with the queen on d5. Now, he could have tried knight e7. It is a bit slower, though. So even if you just play something like this, knight takes knight c5, I want you to notice that this bishop on c8 is quite bad. Incidentally, if you have the isolated pawn, this is very important. Having dark square bishops on the board tends to favor the side like black here. So it depends on the color of the pawn, right? So if you have dark square bishop with a dark square pawn, like you would here, black would like the dark square bishops. Here, the light square bishops are very nice for white. And the main reason for that is a lot of people get this wrong, by the way. So it's something to make sure you know. If you just park a bishop on e3 defending the pawn, it's very passive. It's hard for a dark square bishop to be active. Whereas a light square bishop on any of these diagonals looks just really beautiful. Whereas black's light square bishop, as you can see, is very hard to be active. It would love to be on a square like f7 or something like that to control, again, controlling this square. But notice how even though black has pretty firm control over d5, you're using the pawn to like help your knight. You have moves like knight e6 in the air. You're going to just bring your pieces in. And because white's pieces are extremely active and black's are not, it will pose a huge number of problems to black's position. So even though the pawn is reasonably well blockaded here, you can see how white's position is actually very, very strong. So in the game, Naka played queen takes d5, which is understandable. He doesn't want to give up the tempi involved to play knight e7 to d5, which makes sense. Nepomniachtchi played a really nice move, knight e4. And Nakamura really surprised me with queen d8. I don't know whether that means he disliked his position intensely or whether he... I think he had a particular idea which actually worked out in the game, but I definitely don't think it had to. It could also be he didn't like too many moves. Like I think when I was looking at this game, I wanted to move b6 to try to control this knight a bit better. But allowing rook c1 hitting that stuff is kind of annoying, right? You can play back to d8 now. The advantage here is there's no knight coming to c5, which is at least sort of nice. But there are plenty of good moves. For example, bishop here looks very strong. You might try to push this pawn. You might just bring your pieces out, like queen out, and just advance your pieces. But this was less scary to me. At least the bishop here is not going to like try to checkmate you or do anything too horrifying. But it's still clear that white's the one in charge. So he plays back. So one thing, this is definitely something worth noting, though, which is that when you have an isolated pawn, unless it's just like major pieces, but even there, the queen is a terrible blockader of an isolated pawn. This is something that's kind of known. If you've studied the topic, you might know this, but it's something worth noting. And the reason why is because any piece can attack it and it has to move. You park a knight there, if a knight attacks it, you can leave it as long as it's supported, right? With a queen, it just gets kicked too easily. And what happens when it gets kicked too easily, something like this, is that you're no longer blockading the pawn, right? You lose control a little bit of the square in front of the pawn, which actually brings me to my next question. What would you play here? So once again, try to follow some of these rules I've been telling you. Try to follow the principles. Calculating some lines definitely helps, but what exactly would you do here? So if you're decided on knight c5, this is a perfectly good move. There's nothing wrong with parking your knight on c5. But personally, I actually even prefer this move. You push the pawn, like I said. Now, the pawn, the lack of space is not as big a deal here, largely because there just aren't that many pieces. But now that the pawn no longer can be blockaded on d5, I think it presents a lot of problems. First of all, pushing it to d6 is not not necessarily a trivial matter, because like if a knight lands on d6, that's going to pose all sorts of problems. If he plays the move he did in the game with f5, we simply play knight c5. We have knight e6 anytime we want, creating a very dangerous pawn. We don't have to play it right away. It's very clear something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. And if black plays bishop d7, which I thought was the more likely move, we have choices. I looked at this position briefly with another GM I study with, and he wanted to right away take this and play here, which looks really tempting. You're attacking the pawn, you're threatening knight e6 in some cases. It is probably quite good for white. I actually prefer this move myself, with the idea of you leave white, you keep these bishops on the board, you're ready to play d6 at any moment. If black plays something like this, you can even just trudge ahead, right? And rook c1 is coming. I mean, just a nightmare of a position. Like, I just would hate to be black here. And you can see how your pieces are just far more active, and because black lost control of the pawn and you were able to advance it, the pawn became a strength and not a weakness. But, like I said, it's extremely important to play with some degree of urgency and precision. Urgency can be the wrong word. Like, I don't think, like, moves like rook c1, knight c5 are all probably quite reasonable as well. But you want to have a very clear sense of purpose and play very actively. Nepomniachtchi played the move bishop c2, which to me tells me he was really fixated on trying to attack, which is reasonable if it works. But I think he missed Nakamura's very slick reply, which is f5. And the idea is that after knight c5, b6, there are some challenges with, like, you're kind of losing your grip on these squares. So he ended up retreating to d3. And even though Naka didn't take the pawn on d4, maybe he could have. What he played was actually very reasonable. But notice how you played one inaccuracy, and all of a sudden black's pieces are out, and the position makes more sense. White never should be in danger. I think the game ended up just drawing after this. He finally puts the pawn on d5, but look how strong black's pieces are compared to how they were. But it's very clear that whatever white had has gone by the wayside. And trying to play like knight e6, I think was not so great, because now I think knight f4 kind of ideas are very annoying. Or even just the very simple queen d7 and just playing rook a d8. And it's very clear that this pawn now is just becoming kind of a weakness. You have to be careful as black. Like, I think if you allow like some kind of weird checkmate kind of thing, like this kind of thing exists, so maybe you have to be a bit careful. Once again, and I'm gonna tell you this, I really try to avoid computer checking everything if I can. And the main reason for this is that I want to kind of give you my thoughts as I'm looking through the position and how I would view it. And whenever you see the computer, you're just trying to go, okay, so it wants this. But it's not the one drawback of this, if there is one. I mean, I think it is a drawback, is that not every move I suggest might be perfectly accurate. So you might want to check. One thing I do sometimes is that I will prepare a lesson and then check it with a computer. I do that sometimes, especially for certain topics, to make sure I'm not giving you complete lunacy. But because I'm talking about a lot of very more general things, I think it's important to know how I would actually think about it, and not, well, computer says knight f4 is better than queen d7, or whatever it says there. Again, I try not to do that. So, but the important thing here is that I do believe that d5 is a very strong move. And the reason why is because you're pushing your isolated pawn. You're trying to play d6. You still have knight c5 to e6. And in general, it's just very, very pleasant. So it was a bit of a missed opportunity for Nepomniachtchi. And as we know, with how close the tournament was, pulling off this win could have been really nice. So the next game I want to show is actually with Nakamura on the white side against Fabiano. So you have to keep in mind that these players obviously understand all of this stuff. And usually when they make mistakes, it is based on some kind of precise calculation thing going wrong. Not that their understanding is necessarily perfect, of course. They can make understanding or positional errors. But a lot of their errors really stem from a deep calculated line going a bit astray. So bishop c2, it could have been Nepomniachtchi just didn't see this f5 move. He thought that he had some very strong attack, which maybe he would have had if it weren't for that very strong move by Hikaru. So in this position, Hikaru was white against Fabiano. And this was a very interesting position because I saw, like I was watching like with the chess dojo. Shout out to them, by the way. They did a really great job, I thought. And it was really fun following their thoughts on the positions. And I thought it was very instructive. I definitely learned some things watching it, and I thought it was really cool. But one thing I noticed is they all kind of liked black here. And I was like, really? Now, part of this I have to admit, so I've actually studied with a lot of those guys, Jesse and David, and they're much more averse to the isolated pawn than I am, so that's part of it. But I really liked white in this position. And the main reason for that is because, number one, the queen is blockading the pawn. That is not where it's supposed to be. We have the light square bishops. These are the correct bishops. We also have definite attacking potential against the black king. And we have good e-file, right? Like, we're the one with the e-file and things like that. So I actually thought that Fabiano was in quite severe danger here. I believe what happened was he was trying to do something else earlier and miscalculated something. I think he may have been able to sack a piece on g2 and regain something, and it was some huge mess, right? And maybe he miscalculated something or whatever. I don't think it was his intention to have to withdraw the knight to g6, which is what he did. But this position was looked very unpleasant. Hikaru plays the very, very simple and strong rook a e1. And this looked just terrible. And it's kind of tricky. Like, it's not necessarily that easy. And once again, I have to reiterate that if you do not play aggressively, if you give black time, they're going to be doing quite well. And let me give you an example of that. So the move knight e7, I think, would be a very reasonable move. You're trying to move the queen and park a knight on d5. But the problem is, if I play something like this and play this move, all of a sudden you have an issue, because even if you park the knight there, I start threatening mate. And even though you've secured the square, this is one thing. You secure the square. That's a big battle won. But when you have a king that is weak, like it is here, sometimes that battle's not enough. You can try withdrawing the knight, but I think a move like knight e4 looks particularly strong. And this is a case where trades do not help you. All of a sudden, queen h7 is coming. This is very clearly a huge disaster for black. Not that queen h7 is necessarily instant mate, but your king is weak forever, and I'm also threatening stuff like queen h8 and takes on g7. It's just really bad news. So it's very important that you can't really do that. So Fabiano plays knight f8, which is a very understandable move. There's an old adage with the knight on f8, you cannot get mated. Which is kind of true sometimes. But the problem is this knight on f8 cannot control the very crucial square in front of the pawn. And what this means is that it's going to be very hard for black to get a very firm grip on all these squares. If he could achieve queen moves, bishop d5, knight e6, he'd be in business. Then the pawn could even be targeted. But the problem is your king would then be exposed. So because you have a king that can never find safety, you can't really ever take advantage of the fact that this pawn is isolated. And so Hikaru plays this move. And here he plays something quite understandable. He plays the move h5, which makes a lot of sense. He's basically locking down these pawns. The idea is if the knight ever moves, you have queen d3. It's very convenient. So I think this move was quite a decent try. Quite a decent move. This was one case where I was actually very curious because I really liked this move queen f4. But I did not calculate everything properly. This is a nice little one for you. After the move knight d7, it's extremely important that white has a certain move here. Because if black's able to put the knight on f6 and kind of, help repel white's pieces, this is actually not so great. But you have a very, very cool move here if you want to pause and try to figure it out. Because in general, I wanted to play queen f4. It looked like a more aggressive move, trying to improve the queen, get the queen into the attack. So the move here, which is really neat, is this move. the only move I think that secures an advantage for white. But it is an extremely strong move, and now black's in a whole heap of trouble. I think this was a position the computer did want to play knight f6, which I think is just very ugly. And I think you're not even going to take this queen. You're going to play queen e4. And I think that's really horrible. Once again, if g6, you can always punch through with a move like h5. And it's quite clear that black's in a whole heap of trouble. But the idea is that if takes, you play queen takes knight, threatening mate. If they defend it with f6, you play queen back. And there's no good way to defend this pawn. This is kind of a funny thing, because the queen controls c7, so you can't play queen c7. If queen e7, bam. So you would be able to pin the queen, but you can also just checkmate. And queen d7 fails to knight takes f6 check. The pawn is pinned. So you actually just kind of lose. You could try g5, but it's kind of clear that this will not hold up. It's one of those things where, yeah, it's a move. But there's all sorts of problems with a move like this. You can even take this pawn, I think, would be perfectly fine. And you have all sorts of options on how to maneuver your queen in and attack stuff. So, you know, moves like queen d3, all this stuff, it's going to be extremely unpleasant, to say the least. So g5 would be the best try, but you're going to get crushed if you do that. Your king is way too open. So, yeah, so queen f4 would have been really strong. He played h5, which is also perfectly fine. Again, I would have tried b6 if I were black. Like, the main idea is I want to get in c5, which I actually think is a reasonable idea, because, again, it's funny. I want to trade off these pawns. Like, I want to open the center of the board so I do not get checkmated, is basically the theme. But honestly, it's still a very ugly position. You could improve the queen still, or something like that is still possible. Even moves like b4 are pretty annoying. Even here, I would try this, just to, again, try to get the rook in, harass white a little bit, but it's a very depressing position. So, like I said, kind of h5 is sort of a very understandable sort of move. And like I said, I wanted queen f4, but I didn't see the whole knight d7, knight h5 thing, so it would have been hard for me to play if I didn't see that, right? So h5 is, like, just really natural move. Bishop d7 was played, and after this, the position just became almost unplayable. This pawn, as you can see, is not remotely a weakness. It's a perfectly fine piece. And because white has more aggressively placed pieces, that's what really decides the game. It's not that the pawn is particularly strong, it's that it's not a liability, and the strength of white's pieces is very irritating. But I would say that the extra space white gained from the pawn made attacking easier, and this is a common strength of an isolated pawn, that you have a little bit of that extra central space, and it really helps you attack, because you also control lots of squares. So attacking is a really great strength of the isolated pawn. So as Hikaru built an attack, it's very good. And yeah, this game kind of ended with a blunder. The game went like this. Hikaru played a very nice move, queen b4, hitting this b7 pawn. And he tries to get out of it with b5. He really has to play something else. But no matter what he does, he's going to basically drop the house. Like queen b7 is coming. And after b5, he ends it with a really pretty tactic. Knight d5. And the point is, this knight is hit, as is the queen. So he resigned. Anyway, I thought that this was a really instructive, example of how the isolated pawn can be quite strong. So of course, again, you can show plenty of examples where it's a weakness as well, usually when the game is more simplified. But it's very important to know how to play with an isolated pawn, whether it's in a regular part of your repertoire. If you played normal d4 stuff, there's probably at least one system where there's an IQP. If you play Panov against the Caro-Kann, there's probably a system where you play IQP. So knowing how to play it, whether you get it regularly or not, is an important chess skill. And the things to remember are, number one, the most important thing is controlling the square in front of the pawn if you are able to. If you're not able to, if your opponent can blockade that square, you want to use your pawn to use the squares the pawn controls. Do not allow the game to simplify too much, and try to build an initiative often on the king side. And that's usually how you want to try to play with it. There are plenty of other features of an isolated pawn. There's all sorts of things I picked up. Trading rooks, for example, actually tends to not be bad when you have an isolated pawn. Quite frequently, if your opponent doesn't have any rooks, it's hard for it to become a weakness sometimes. Everything's kind of dependent on the situation a bit, but getting used to the general feel, the general rules, how to build an initiative with an isolated pawn, will really help you. And I especially think that in the current chess environment, a lot of people do not know how to do this. So if you learn how to play well with an isolated pawn, it will definitely benefit you. All right, again, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like my videos, like, subscribe, all of this. Let me know what you think about the format. I'm not sure I love these colors, so I'll probably change it again. But definitely give me some feedback because it's always very useful. Once again, my Chessable course is out. If you like how I teach, if you're kind of beginner to like lower intermediate level, you know, up to 1500 on 1600 on websites, whatever you want to call it, right? You can definitely check out my Chessable course, Beginner Mistakes in the Opening. Beginner Mistakes in the Middle Game has been recorded. I'm waiting for them to tell me. I'm waiting for them to release it, but hopefully that gets released soon as well, so I can share that with you. But anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.